The genesis of this project and the report really goes back to a publication by Dr. Sergei Markodonov, further to my right, in 2009, shortly after the Russian-Georgia War, that was entitled "The Big Caucasus: Consequences of the Five-Day War, New Challenges and Prospects," that was published by the International Center for Black Sea Studies in 2009. And the premise of this study was that to understand this complex region, one needed to look comprehensively at the North Caucasus and the South Caucasus in conjunction with major regional powers, first of all and foremost Russia, but also Turkey, Iran, Ukraine, and others, to help better inform analysis and policy making about the region. And Sergei has been the major intellectual force here in his time as a visiting scholar with CSIS and the development of this project, for which I'm very grateful personally to him. As the title of the report suggests, there are powerful centripetal and centrifugal forces in the region which remains very much in flux. So-called frozen conflicts in Nagorno-Karabakh, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia remain unresolved, and tensions in particular over Nagorno-Karabakh have increased in recent years, and if this conflict were to reignite, the consequences would be far more devastating and destabilizing than the war 20 years ago. Key borders remain closed, and most recently a virtual proxy conflict between Iran and Israel has spilled over into the region as well through targeted assassinations. Regional conflicts and instability are a powerful check on more positive forces of globalization that can enhance connectivity and prospects for prosperity in the region. The report, authored by Jeff and reflecting his views, was deeply informed by a conference that we held here at CSIS in October of last year, entitled "The Big Caucasus: Old Ethnopolitical Conflicts and New Geopolitical Design." And the program and the participants in that conference you can find in the report that you've received today. This project, including the conference, publication, and residencies of Jeff and Sergei here at CSIS, have been generously supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York through a grant to the Russian Eurasia program, and I want to express my sincere thanks to them for their continuing support. You have the biographies of our distinguished panelists today. I would like to express a special thanks to Ambassador John Evans for joining us today, given his rich experience in the region, in his time with the State Department, including in one of his first postings, if not his first posting, to Iran, as he put it, back in the good old days. There is no business like Shaw business. But he has, as you see from his biography, a tremendous amount of experience throughout this region, and we're especially grateful for him sharing his special insights, and in particular how to think about this from a policymaking perspective. Now obviously, there are no easy solutions to the challenges we have that we will be discussing today. And our task as analysts is to be as rigorous and dispassionate as possible and to try to provide some value added in understanding the challenges that we face, and think a little bit outside the box about solutions. Now, so often here in Washington and elsewhere, when it comes to discussing this region, much of the rhetoric becomes very, very heated and passionate, and sometimes perhaps less illuminating than it could be. But I trust that our discussion today will err on the side of illumination rather than passion. So with no further ado, let me first turn to Jeff Mankoff, who will present some of the key concepts and findings in the report. Jeff?
Thank you very much, Andy and Sergei and John, for being here today. Thanks to all of you, and of course to the participants in the conference whose contributions are essential to putting together this report. Andy already touched on a little bit the analytic notion of the Big Caucasus that we've been talking about and what specifically it is, so I don't want to dwell on that. But I do want to spend a minute to talk about why this matters, why we in the Washington analytic and policy community should care about the fact that the Caucasus actually exists within this broader region and has connections that tie it to developments to its north, its south, its east, and its west. If you just look at a map, it's clear that the Caucasus represents an important bridge. It, in some ways, is part of a transit corridor between north and south, between east and west. It's at the crossroads that promotes connections or creates divisions between Europe, Central Asia, the Middle East, and other parts of the world. And for that reason, if no other, developments in the Caucasus are of vital importance to these and other surrounding regions. Of course, as Andy mentioned, there are centrifugal forces at play in the Caucasus which have kept the region fragmented and fractured for much of its post-Soviet history. And not only do these processes of fragmentation inhibit the connectivity, the globalization, and the integration, which is the key to the future prosperity of the region itself, but they also pose dangers for the surrounding regions, for the other non-Caucasian powers that comprise what we, in this report and as part of the conference and the program surrounding it, describe as the Big Caucasus. More positively, though, there is a vision in which this region can play its historic role once again as a regional crossroads, as a bridge between these different world areas. It is in part a keystone on the vision of the creation of a new Silk Road, linking Central Asia to Europe and points further west. It is also a critical piece of the United States and the European Union's plans for the establishment of the so-called Southern Energy Corridor, bringing energy from the east side of the Caspian Sea to Europe. Now this is the vision, this idea of connectivity and integration that we should be promoting, and that in the recommendation section of the report we focus on. That is in a lot of ways the most positive future that we can hope for this part of the world. But getting there requires overcoming a series of very severe and ingrained challenges. And I just want to go through some of these very quickly. Probably you're all very familiar with at least aspects of the situation in the Caucasus, but nevertheless, I want to just help give you a sense of why it is that this positive vision of integration and connectivity has actually been so difficult to reach in practice, despite 20 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. First and foremost, I think it's important to look at the geopolitical fragmentation of the region, which in part is a consequence of the Soviet collapse itself. There are, as Andy said, protracted or frozen conflicts that dot the region and which pose themselves a major obstacle to the vision of integration that we would like to see emerge. Just in the South Caucasus alone, there are 6 states and un- or partially recognized statelets, which between them have closed borders, have created large numbers of refugees and displaced persons across the entire region, and where the potential for renewed violence has not disappeared, despite, at least in the case of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, actual fighting on the ground having been over for close to 15 years. This fragmentation has resulted in different rates of development within the different political entities of the South Caucasus and has promoted the emergence of competing strategic axes, one going east-west, comprising particularly Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey, and then on to Europe, tied together through the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline and other planned energy projects, as well as the kind of strategic orientation that's emerged among these countries since the Soviet collapse. Conversely, there's increasingly a kind of north-south axis among countries that have been excluded from this vision. And the existence of these two competing axes raises the possibility of polarization and confrontation throughout the region. As I already said, given the larger regional context and the number of outside players with interests in the Big Caucasus region, there are the potential for regional consequences of any exacerbation of the violence or the fragmentation within the Caucasus, the possibility of this unrest or this instability or violence spilling over and affecting other countries. At the same time, because of this political fragmentation within almost all of the political entities recognized, unrecognized, and partially recognized within the South and North Caucasus, political systems have not evolved to deal with many of the social and economic problems that the populations face. In part, this is because of a process of warping of domestic politics where focusing on status issues on questions of rivalry between the different political entities has prevented a focus on resolving day-to-day problems that affect peoples and populations across the entire region. Indeed, if we look at the entire Caucasus region, we see a worrying proliferation of political rigidity, authoritarianism, misgovernance, and growing frustration on the part of populations across the region. And this is true in both the North Caucasus and in the South Caucasus. In fact, there was just today a report from Interfax, the Russian news agency, that the Russian audit chamber had determined that $85 million had been embezzled from the federal budget in Russia that was designated to go towards the budgets of the North Caucasus areas in 2011. This represented 10% of the entire amount that was budgeted by Moscow for economic and political operations in the entire region. And this is just one example. There are similar problems, not only in the North Caucasus, but in many parts of the South Caucasus as well. I don't need to go through all of these, but certainly if you look at the North Caucasus, you can see the breakdown of governance in a number of the regions, the waning of Moscow's ability to control political developments on the ground, and even as the insurgency in Chechnya, which was responsible for much of the unrest and the breakdown in governance in this region in the 1990s and into the last decade, has been tamped down under the hand of the authoritarian Chechen regime of Ramzan Kadyrov. One of the consequences has been a spread of radicalism and militancy to other areas of the North Caucasus. And so now you see the spread of violence, of Islamism, of militancy, even to parts of the North Caucasus, which until quite recently had not experienced this kind of unrest. And there's a clear danger that as Moscow's ability to determine political outcomes in the region wanes, that problems that have until quite recently been associated primarily with Chechnya will spread further across the entire region. If you look at the South Caucasus, of course, we don't need any reminder about the standoff between Georgia and its breakaway regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which led to military conflict in 2008. Even though there's been a pulling back from the precipice on the part of all the actors in the region since 2008, the fact remains that this conflict remains latent, it remains just below the surface, and little progress has been made on addressing the underlying issues that led to that conflict in the first place. Certainly with the question of Georgia's membership in NATO, this, of course, still remains on the agenda. NATO is still committed to ultimately providing Georgia with a path towards membership, even if it's not being talked about in the present tense right now. Though with the upcoming NATO summit in Chicago, it certainly holds the potential to once again see discussion of this issue rise towards the top of the political agenda. And there's another reason why this subsumed conflict in the South Caucasus is important, and again, this gets to the question of the existence of this broader Big Caucasus. And that is the way in which developments in Georgia and its breakaway regions have the potential to affect political developments on the other side of the Caucasus range, that is to say in the North Caucasus. As we know, it was Russia's provision of passports, essentially granting citizenship to populations in South Ossetia and Abkhazia that laid the foundation for Russia's ultimate military intervention in 2008. At the same time, Georgia has increasingly injected itself into the politics of the North Caucasus, instituting, for example, visa-free travel in the region and promoting the Circassian issue ahead of the 2014 Olympics. So once again, we can see how these political issues, these conflicts can't simply be contained in one or another political entity in the Big Caucasus region, but rather flow in both directions across the borders. By far the most dangerous conflict in the region, though, is that between Armenia and Azerbaijan, in part over the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. Obviously, in this town, Nagorno-Karabakh has received less attention in recent years compared to the conflicts in Georgia or to the growth of extremism and terrorism in the Russian North Caucasus. But in a lot of ways, this is the most dangerous of all of the Caucasian conflicts, in part because it remains unresolved because of the potential for a return to interstate military conflict involving Armenia and Azerbaijan. Given the failure of the normalization protocol between Turkey and Armenia in 2009, in some ways the broader geopolitical or international situation around the Armenia-Azerbaijan dispute is less flexible today than it was several years ago, even as the situation on the ground becomes increasingly alarming with an increase in sniper shootings and other kinds of border incidents, while at the same time military buildup underway in the region, which makes it, in the longer run, more likely that there'll be a resort to violence in an attempt to solve the conflict rather than less. And of course, given ties outside of the Caucasus region itself, between Azerbaijan and Turkey, between Armenia and Russia, and also the increasingly prominent regional role of Iran, there are broader regional consequences to any resumption of violence in this region, the consequences of which we don't know and may not necessarily be able to control. Now, of course, the notion that there is such a thing as the Big Caucasus implies that there's a diverse collection of international actors who are involved in the region as well, not just the states that we typically think of as being part of the Caucasus itself, but a variety of other players as well. And just one example that I want to give of how events in the Caucasus have this broader regional strategic component is the expansion of the Israeli-Iranian standoff, which is increasingly spread into the Caucasus region itself. This includes security cooperation between Azerbaijan and Israel, which overlays a long-standing close relationship between Armenia and Iran, which holds the potential both for the Israeli-Iranian conflict to have regional consequences in the Caucasus, but also for an exacerbation of the Armenian-Azeri standoff in the Caucasus to have broader consequences, not just for that region, but for the Middle East as well. Speaking about outside powers, though, and we go through these in much greater detail in the report, the major powers that we want to examine and we can talk about in more detail if there's interest here are Russia, which of course is in some ways the status quo power, the one that was the regional hegemon throughout the Soviet period and remains the most influential actor among the outside players. But of course, as I said, Russia's hold in the North Caucasus is waning, and given the proliferation of other actors in the South Caucasus, it's no longer clear that Russia plays the dominant role in the South Caucasus that it played for much of the Soviet and early post-Soviet region either. And that, I think, opens the region up to the increasing strategic competition of other players as well. And among these in the report, there are sections focusing on Turkey, which is in some ways the most important of the rising actors in the region. One whose pursuit of strategic independence under its current government of the Justice and Development Party makes it more of a wild card than it has been in some time, albeit an increasingly important one given its cultural, economic, and political weight in the region. There's also Iran, which I already touched on, which has a long-standing connection to Armenia and whose relationship with Azerbaijan has become increasingly fraught in recent years, in part because of the conflict in the Caucasus, and in part because of its own issues in the region and with Israel in the Middle East. There's also Ukraine and the European Union, which play important, if sometimes underappreciated, roles in the Caucasus. And finally, I just want to close by talking a little bit about the United States. Obviously, given that we're releasing this report in Washington and we're talking to a Washington policy audience, I think probably there's the most interest in how all of this affects the United States and United States foreign policy. And the argument that we make in the report is that it is in the U.S. interest to promote this idea of connectivity, globalization, and integration throughout the Caucasus region, and that the United States, by and large, recognizes this. The ideal which the U.S. has pursued for much of the history since the end of the Cold War is to be a kind of honest broker in the region, a country without parochial interests, a non-regional player that therefore can take a more dispassionate role. That at least is the idea. In practice, of course, it has at times fallen short, and what we try to do in the report is suggest ways to cope with the fact that the U.S. has not always quite lived up to this idea of being an honest broker in the region. Part of the problem, of course, is that the Caucasus has often been a secondary area of focus for the United States. It's often been secondary to other political interests in the post-Soviet region and elsewhere. And so attention from Washington to the Caucasus as a whole has at times been sporadic. When the U.S. has decided to focus intently on the region, it can and often does do good. A good recent example of this is the agreement between Russia and Georgia on Russia's WTO entry, which the U.S. helped promote and encourage with help from the EU and the Swiss. The Northern Distribution Network, much of which goes through the North Caucasus, or through the Caucasus, is another example of this. However, because U.S. attention has often been sporadic, at times it has allowed itself to get away from this idea of being a kind of impassionate, honest broker. One consequence has been a kind of narrow focus on the territorial issue as being the defining element in U.S. engagement with many of the actors in different parts, particularly of the South Caucasus. This narrow focus on territorial integrity has, even in areas where it has actually been quite tenuous ever since, and even going back to before the Soviet collapse, has made it more difficult for the U.S. to focus on dealing with specific problems on the ground, for example, problems of refugees, and has made it difficult, if not impossible, for the U.S. to engage or deal with the authorities in the non-recognized entities throughout the Caucasus. And of course, whether they're recognized or not, they do control this territory. They do have citizens whose interests need to be in some way managed. And the fact that they remain outside of these international processes makes it harder to actually deal with some of these problems. And in some ways, it makes the resolution of problems across the Caucasus more difficult. The U.S. approach to the energy question, promotion of first the BTC and South Caucasus pipelines, and now its involvement in the Southern Corridor, has been relatively successful in terms of actually getting these pipelines built and in terms of promoting European energy security, which has been, I think, the underlying premise of much of this diplomacy. At the same time, the way that this pipeline diplomacy has been done in the Caucasus has contributed in some ways to reinforcing regional fragmentation by cementing these axes that I talked about further, by bringing together Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey, but in a way that leaves Armenia and some of the other players in the region outside. And while this has been good for Europe, this has been good for Turkey, this has been good for Azerbaijan and Georgia, it has in some ways also contributed to regional fragmentation in the Caucasus. And then, of course, there's the question of how the Caucasus fits into U.S. relations and U.S. strategy vis-a-vis Russia. Certainly, since the end of the war in 2008, there's been less focus on this region as an element in the bilateral relationship between Moscow and Washington. Yet, the fundamental issues that divide the U.S. from Russia have not gone away. Despite the Northern Distribution Network, despite an agreement to kind of disagree on the question of Georgia's NATO membership for the time being, these fundamentally incompatible visions of the Caucasus and its role in the global balance remain between the U.S. and Russia. And even if the reset between Washington and Moscow has succeeded in putting some of these issues off to the side, they haven't gone away. They're still on the agenda. They are going to come back at some point. And I think the United States needs to be ready to figure out how to engage Moscow on these questions to avoid having a repeat of the situation that it got itself into before and during 2008. Above all, I think in terms of dealing with the region, the United States needs to promote integration. It needs to promote this idea of connectivity as the best solution for the fissipariousness of the Caucasus. It's the best way to bring stability, prosperity, and security to people across the entire region. And this implies integration in all directions, to the west, but also to the north and the east, and perhaps once the situation around Iran and its nuclear program is solved, to the south as well. I think one of the big takeaways for the last 20 years is that economic incentives are not enough. Politics, particularly in this region, has to take precedence. And here's an area where I think the role of the United States is fundamental. If there are going to be political solutions, if the political fragmentation that has riven this region for so long is going to be addressed, I think the United States needs to play a major role in bringing together the different actors, both within the Caucasus and in the surrounding region. It needs to be a convener. It needs to come back to playing this role of an honest broker, to which it has long aspired. And in doing that, to promote political solutions rather than just a preservation of the status quo. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, for such a concise and comprehensive summary of the key points in the report. Let me now turn to Dr. Sergei Markodonov to add his thoughts about this.
Thank you, Andy. First of all, let me thank Andy Kachis for kind words addressed to me and my role in the Big Caucasus consideration and study. Honestly speaking, Jeff put very complicated task before me, because it would be easier for me personally to have deal with a very weak report. It would be easier to criticize him and to find some failures, mistakes, and to make my own revisions and objections. But Jeff prepared very sophisticated observation of the very, very complicated region. First, I'm not going to retell basic ideas of his report. He made it brilliantly a couple of minutes ago, and you would have good opportunity to read directly this report. Only some ideas. First of all, I think Jeff managed to overcome typical traditional approach dominating here in the United States to consider the Big Caucasus like chessboard, where big games or big geopolitical games between United States and Russia are provided. He demonstrated complexities of this region, and he showed many different angles and aspects of the Caucasus. I mean here the raising role of Turkey, role of Iran, problem of relationship between not only the West and Russia, but Russia and another regional stakeholders. I think that one of the best plus of his report is absence of politicized estimations of the region. Honestly speaking, I'm a little bit worried starting my reading the policy recommendation chapter, because traditionally I perceive this chapter like a number of blah 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 recommendations, but this chapter made by Jeff was rather different, because it was first and foremost good observation of opportunities of US, real resources, real minuses of US demonstrated previously in the Georgian direction of their policy and so on. This is why I found this report like balanced and professional. It's not coincident that this report before its launching raised great interest, and for a recent 3 or 5 days I got many messages from my friends from Armenia, Georgia, Abkhazia, diaspora, guys in Turkey about this report. How would it be possible to have access? And I think this way that this report would be very good for Russian audience as well as Turkish audiences. For Iranians, it's a great secret to receive any real adequate reaction on this report. This is why it's good ground for professional discussion. And I could continue my positive estimations of Jeff's report, but let me, in the conditions of the deficit of the time, take some time to critical notes, because I don't agree on him on 100%. Because if you would speak about the report from Washington, this approach would look perfect. But I think the original viewpoint needs maybe a little bit more detailed and nuanced explanations of some points. It's necessary to have more adequate estimation of the region. Only a couple of nuances which I catched from his report. The first one concerns Ramzan Kadyrov. Some time ago, it was practically impossible to imagine for me to be advocate of Ramzan Kadyrov. You know that this guy characterized me in 2007 as an enemy of the Chechen people. But today, enemy of Chechen people tries to be a little bit advocate of Ramzan Kadyrov. Jeff characterized him as a one-time warlord and a guy who created a Sharia-themed regime on the territory of Chechnya. Yes, Ramzan Kadyrov originally was warlord, but his phenomenon it's impossible to restrict only by warlordism phenomenon. It's wider. Moreover, don't forget that Ramzan Kadyrov was appointed by Kremlin in strict accordance of the Russian legislation. Now he's a president of Chechnya. It maybe was strange if we would speak about Yasser Arafat as a warlord after Oslo Accords. Originally, yes, but many peoples originally were warlords, but then they transformed to politicians. In the case of Ramzan Kadyrov, maybe it was necessary to mention his one-time warlordism, but now he's the president of the Russian entity and politician. As for Sharia-ing regime, I'm not sure, because Ramzan Kadyrov is an instrumental politician. He is opportunist. He invites Ksenia Sobchak. He builds water parks. He is ready to have boxing with Mike Tyson. I'm not sure on conditions of Ramzan Kadyrov after this challenge. But anyway, and all those cases are not described in the context of Sharia norms. Yes, sometimes he could appeal to Sharia, but at the same time he could appeal to Chechen nationalism and be elected like General Secretary of all Chechens and so on. And to be defender of a New Year tree in the center of Grozny, unlike guys in Dagestan, and so on. This is why it's more complex and complicated point. Then the second point of criticism is addressed to chapter 2, regional stakeholders. I mean here a phrase about Russia's invasion of Georgia. I mean here term invasion. I could not demand from Jeff to share my point of view or some other, but I am not thinking that this situation could be characterized only like invasion of big northern country against peaceful small Georgia and so on. I'm a historian by my education, and it's habitual for me to start any investigations on the sources. Jeff is also a historian as well as me. I think it would be better to mention only like note EU Talyavini report, who made detailed observation on situation in Georgia in 2008 and share responsibility between Russia and Georgia. Because it's the part of a complex and long story that aggression or invasion of Russian Federation against Georgia. It's a part of big and long conflict going back to the early 90s. And it's only part of this process. Maybe it would be better to make more nuanced and detailed observation on this. And last but not least point concerns chapter on policy recommendations. On 99%, I agree with conclusions of this chapter. I'm repeating once again, it's prepared highly and professionally. It's not a repetition of some traditional politicized approach existing here, but by agreeing on his conclusions on potential positive role of United States, in my mind it would be better to say something, maybe a couple or 3 phrases about normalization or facilitation, as you like, of relationship between United States and Russia as a key prerequisite for the role of United States as honest broker. Because yes, honest brokering role is very good and highly appreciated. But what's the price of this role? What benefits, profits for different countries, and concrete mechanisms of transformation of the United States from interested supporter of Georgia to honest broker role? What's the role of Russia, the biggest regional stakeholder in this process? How would Russia and the United States cooperate to make this transformation real? Jeff in his report many times repeated that Russia is still now key regional stakeholder. This is why without the Russian factor, it's impossible to consider transformation of the United States and its interests, their interests in this region. Now let me stop and say thanks once again for the sophisticated report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sergey. Now let me turn to Ambassador Evans.
Thank you, Andy. First of all, I hope a lot of you have copies of the report, and I just wanted to point out that this picture here is actually a picture of Jeff. This was before he started shaving. I have to join the consensus in saying that this is truly an excellent report. It's comprehensive, it's professional. I personally think it's very close to right, if anything can be said to be right in an academic report. And I'd just like to, so full credit to the author and all those who worked on it. The conference from October is recognizable in the report, but I'd just like to stress that this report is something totally new. If you think, for example, of the Supreme Court discussion of last week, one could listen to that or get a transcript of that, but how different that would be from the final report that we'll expect in June. And really, it's comparable. This report represents a great deal more work. As I said, the discussions in October can be sensed, and traces of them are there. I think it's particularly commendable that in this report, it's very strong on the important energy dimension. And that's not a surprise, given that this is CSIS, which has always been strong on those questions. But even as it is very strong on the energy dimension, it is making the point that the political issues are number one. They're at the top. They're the decisive issues in the long run. I have just a few little points to make, and they're not criticisms of the authors. They're perhaps a plea from the people who keep the budgets. They're very good maps. They could have been in color. We're all used to better maps than we see in this report. They're very good because it's hard to get both the pipeline information and all the other political information, and it's a real art to do this. But if your budget people can give you more. I saw that your other report on China and Afghanistan actually had no maps. So this is really commendable to have those many good ones, and charts and statistics. It was very good. I do think, and this is a question, what is the role of think tanks in Washington? This report is very professional. The State Department would find it absolutely extremely well done. That's no surprise. Jeff spent some time there. They know his work. He knows how they work. But the question I have is, should think tanks be in this town even a little bit more daring? Could one use sidebars, for example, to make it clear that these are just ideas that we're throwing out? Could one generate a few more sparks? I mean, this is what has been done. Again, I want to stress, full credit. But just to raise the question, do we need more discussion of things that are, and I have to say, Jeff has pushed pretty far here in talking about the United States fixation on the question of territorial integrity and that particular principle of international law. I also wish there had been more use of Colonel John Chicky's good information from October. Several of us who heard the discussion in October on the second day, I believe it was, were really quite amazed by the specter that emerged from his discussion of how the military situation between Azerbaijan and Armenia has changed since the end of full-scale hostilities in 1994. That brings me back to one of the points that is a strength of this report. It rightly points to the Karabakh situation as the most dangerous flashpoint in the Caucasus today. In 2008, in August, when we had the flare-up between Georgia and Russia, I think a lot of people were reminded that the potential for violence in the Caucasus is there. And I remember that it was Tom DeWall, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, who made the point within 6 weeks after that event that really the most dangerous flashpoint remains Nagorno-Karabakh, and the report gets that right. I initially had some problem with calling this area the Big Caucasus because it sounds a little infelicitous, and I know Sergei has talked with several people about that. But as I think, I would prefer to say the Greater Caucasus, perhaps. But I think the good thing about calling it this is it kind of catches you, and I think people will pay attention when they hear about something called the Big Caucasus. It really packs a wallop. So I withdraw my initial dissatisfaction over that. Now, of course, time marches on, and in October we were not thinking so much as we are today about we had a very good discussion of Iran at that conference, but we weren't thinking about issues that were raised by Mark Perry's piece in Foreign Policy last week, in which he reported, based on talks with unnamed U.S. intelligence officials, that Israel has obtained basing rights in Azerbaijan. Had that news been out there in October, I think we would have had a different discussion. We can't expect a report to be totally up to date, but the discussion and the paper provide a very good basis for discussions going onward. The other thing that, of course, was not so clearly obvious at that time was the distraction that Syria is proving to be for Turkey and others in the region. So all in all, I would just say, again, full credit to CSIS, to Jeff, Sergei, and Andrew for for producing this report. It's very much worthy of people's study, and I commend it to all of you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. So now we're on the record and on video about the need for a larger budget for the program, color maps, amongst other things. Thank you for that plug. And the point is also well taken that I think we can and sometimes should be pushing the envelope harder on some things. But with that having been said, let me open up the floor for questions, comments, and discussion. And please, when I call upon you, would you wait for the microphone and identify yourself for the panelists and anybody else who happens to be watching or listening to this right now. Yes.
Thank you very much for very good presentation of the report. My name is Arsen Karacan. I'm from Voice of America's Armenian Service. Two questions. Two questions. One would be probably for you as the report writer, and the next one would be for everybody, whoever would have an answer to. I just quickly went through the policy recommendations and just tried to see what it is. And that would be actually great if we had the chance to have the report before the presentation, so we would have more precise questions. This is just as a suggestion. The Armenia-Turkey process, basically, as you mentioned in the report, ended up proving that now it's officially part of a package deal. It is, or can we say that it is impossible to develop Armenian-Turkey relations without the Karabakh link, and vice versa? This is the first question. And if so, what should be done from the U.S. perspective in order to make this process go further? And on the issue of, and linked to this process was, as after the process was stopped, the United States invested a lot of money on the track 2 diplomacy. Armenia received about $2.5 million for different levels of discussions with the Turkish counterparts. Can this be helpful also for the Armenian-Azerbaijani part? Because probably this is one of the aspects of the conflict that has the least track 2 activities. Armenia and Azerbaijan, even Georgia and Russia have more of that. And a bigger question about the Armenia and Azerbaijan, as we were talking about the energy policy, and you were talking about the isolation of Armenia from the regional development processes. I've asked these questions several times in different forums. Is there a chance that there can be a discussion over a possible gas pipeline going through Armenia from Azerbaijan, whether it would be Nabucco or anything else, considering that oil prices are going up, and considering that gas is becoming more of a discussion? Is this a pragmatic approach? Because this could probably change a lot in the region, both geopolitically and geoeconomically. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your questions. Let me try and answer all of them. If I leave anything out, remind me. On the question of track 2 diplomacy between Armenia and Azerbaijan, you know, I'm involved in some U.S.-Russia track 2 processes, and I know this is an issue that has come up, and I think there's interest in doing more on specifically Armenia and Azerbaijan. I don't know a lot of the specifics about you know, why there's been so little up to this point, but I know that there's at least interest in doing more on that. What was your first question? I'm sorry. Oh, the normalization protocol. So what are the prospects for progress in Armenian-Turkish relations, given the failure of the normalization protocol and the linkage now between that and the Nagorno-Karabakh issue? You know, I think the lesson from that is you probably have to start small. I think where Turkey came out of that process was that it was taking a position that essentially they couldn't pursue normalization without getting some kind of resolution on the Nagorno-Karabakh issue that was satisfactory to Azerbaijan. So obviously that is a very difficult problem, and that's a very high bar to resolve. So I think if you're looking for progress between Armenia and Turkey, which in the long run is, I think, in the interest of Turkey, is in the interest of Armenia, is in the interest of Azerbaijan, and is frankly in the interest of the surrounding powers as well, you know, you can't at this point, I think, go for a big bang normalization. There have to be kind of incremental steps, and you know, hopefully the leadership in all of those countries and regions is thinking in those terms. So I think there's just more realism of that happening right now. It's unfortunate because I think we are in a situation where there's less flexibility than there was before 2009, and that makes it difficult. On your last question about the pipeline, you know, conceptually, I think that's absolutely right. That, you know, integrating Armenia into these regional development processes, and you know, including through transporter infrastructure such as pipelines, roads, rails, whatever else, is in the long run where you ultimately have to go. But I would just come back to the way that I concluded my presentation, which is by saying that the political has to take precedence. So I think until you have resolution of some of these political problems, even, you know, Nagorno-Karabakh obviously is the centerpiece, but also just, you know, the broader relationship between Armenia and Azerbaijan and Armenia and Turkey, where you have an agreement on, you know, opening borders. It's, you know, you're not going to be able to move ahead with the infrastructure until you have the political framework in place for that.
John, do you want to comment on this?
Yes, I don't disagree with anything that Jeff just said. I would just make a very specific recommendation on the Turkey-Armenia issue. It would be a very simple thing for the two countries, the executives without the legislatures, simply to declare that they have diplomatic relations. There is a public perception that diplomatic relations means you're friends with somebody, or all issues disappear, or there are no territorial problems. Not true. We even have a territorial dispute with Canada. And you know, the Russian Federation has full diplomatic relations with Japan, despite the Northern Territories issue. So just do it, is my view. You could have two ambassadors, an Armenian and Turkish ambassador in Tbilisi can exchange notes, and if they don't think that's enough, register it with the United Nations. On the second point about the gas pipeline, I know that technically it would be no problem to put a gas pipeline through. There was a gas pipeline that went through Goris and it would be very simple to tie it up with pipelines existing in Turkey. So again, it comes back to the point that the political is decisive.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Andrea Nikolaisen from Embassy of Armenia. Normalization process and the process of Nagorno-Karabakh negotiations.
Could you speak up a little bit, please?
Yes, I'm sorry. Relations between Nagorno-Karabakh peace talks and the normalization process between Armenia and Turkey. For the simple reason that this normalization, that these negotiations on Nagorno-Karabakh track were well ongoing before the Armenian-Turkish normalization process started, and then the process halted in the beginning of 2000s. Actually, the Nagorno-Karabakh peace talks, they marked most decisive point perhaps throughout the last years was the summit in Kazan between the presidents of Armenia, Russian Federation and Azerbaijan, and also was very much supported by other two heads of co-chair countries. Unfortunately, in Kazan, the breakthrough was not possible due to the Azerbaijani refusal of accepting the document. So you, of course, connected somehow with the relationship between the normalization process and Nagorno-Karabakh negotiations on the Turkish track. Of course, Turkey makes a precondition of normalization or some breakthrough on Nagorno-Karabakh track to have relations with Armenia improve. But on the other track, on the Nagorno-Karabakh negotiations, do you think there is any implication from the Armenian-Turkish normalization on Nagorno-Karabakh track? Again, I think no, because the negotiations were all going before that and are ongoing now. Actually, in end of January, our statement was signed by the presidents of Armenia and Russian Federation and Azerbaijan, indicating that the relations about the process, appreciating the Minsk process as such. And my second question will go to Armenian-Iranian relations. You mentioned that you actually mentioned two geostrategic relationship in the region, one being between Armenia and Iran and versus the Azerbaijan-Israeli relations as a geopolitical factor in our region. I would like to know what, in your opinion, makes Armenian-Iranian relations remarkable to put it as a factor in a geopolitical situation of South Caucasus, because as far as I know, there are no any remarkable relations between Armenia and Iran to make it as a specific point of interest, point of reference. Of course, we have very good relations with Iran, and that is because our borders are blocked by our neighbors. Yeah, but I don't know any specific area where Armenian-Azerbaijan, Armenian-Iranian relations are more close or more developed, rather than if we compare it to the Iranian-Azerbaijani relations or relations between Georgia and Iran, for example. So these are my two questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. On your first question, I think you're basically right, that for there to be, I think what happened after the failure of the Turkish-Armenian normalization in 2009 was that the momentum has to go back now to the Armenian-Azerbaijani track on Nagorno-Karabakh. So to the extent that there's progress between Baku and Yerevan and Stepanakert on some kind of a resolution on Nagorno-Karabakh, I think that'll make it easier ultimately for Armenian-Turkish relations to improve. So I think you're right that track is more important right now. And certainly we've seen President Medvedev take a very active interest in this. There was the meeting in Kazan, there was another meeting a couple of months ago, I forget where it was. It's mentioned in the report. Was it Sochi? Sochi, yeah. So the Russians in particular have been very active in promoting dialogue on this track with the support of the other participants in the Minsk group. And I think that's ultimately a positive development. One of the things that I highlight in the report is that with the political transition in Russia right now, it's unclear whether there will be the same level of commitment on the part of the new Russian leadership. And so this is an area where I think the U.S. in particular needs to pay attention and ensure that that engagement process that President Medvedev has really been pushing for the last couple of years continues. Whether Russia continues to take the leadership or whether the other co-chairs in the Minsk group play a more prominent role. On your second question about Armenia and Iran, I think you're right. There's nothing particularly remarkable about that relationship. Iran and Armenia are neighbors. As you said, Armenia's borders with most of its other neighbors are closed, which means that the Iranian border is a vital economic lifeline, and that is perfectly rational and logical. I think the only reason to highlight this is just because of the broader geopolitical tension surrounding Iran and the uncertainty about how political developments that originate more likely in the Middle East than in the Caucasus per se affect Iran's engagement beyond its borders, and what the consequences of that could be not only for Armenia but for the region as a whole. So I don't think there's anything particularly unusual or remarkable, as you put it, about relations between Armenia and Iran. I just think the fact that because there is that close relationship, that there could be implications for Armenia and for the region as a whole of any kind of broader political and certainly military crisis involving Iran.
In Nagorno-Karabakh. And it's not coincidence that just after publications in Foreign Policy and some other articles, some other wave of articles were published about absence of interest to break or destroy existing status quo. Let me also react on some points on Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and Armenian and Iranian relations. You said that those relations are not so remarkable. Let me disagree on you. Yes, they are not so remarkable from the Armenian point of view, but from the Azerbaijani point of view, they are very, very remarkable. Because this cooperation promotes Armenia to overcome regional insularity and isolation. It's very, very remarkable. Because in this situation, Azerbaijan received additional, loses additional resources, opportunities for iteration. And point concerning two parallel process, Turkish-Armenian normalization and Nagorno-Karabakh resolution, I am not believing in divorcing this process. Sorry, because Azerbaijani question is not only foreign policy priority of Ankara, it's at the same time question of domestic policy. There are many Azeris, they are voters. There are some lobbyist organizations inside Turkey. It's a very important factor, which every government, Erdogan or some other governments, could not ignore.
I would just add, not having read Mr. Kerry's article, I'm extremely skeptical of this report. And one thing Sergei didn't mention, of course, is the Russian perspective on this. And I would find it very hard to believe that Azerbaijan, Baku, would do this in contravention to the interests of Moscow. I find the risks that Azerbaijan would incur far too high to justify the potential rewards. So let me just express my vote of deep skepticism about this report and its wonderful sources. This will become a higher policy priority in Washington. Kathy, on the Northern Caucasus, I should note that we did a major conference in the fall of 2010, and then a report on the Northern Caucasus that came out about a year ago. And I think that may explain to a considerable extent why in this report we did not address recommendations for the Northern Caucasus. But it's a very good question, noted lacunae. Jeff and Sergei may have other comments as well on that. What does the report recommend about this role of the United States as an honest broker and other related topics? And then, of course, the point about the Russian envoys recently appointed to South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and I think the question getting to the Armenian-U.S. relationship and the increased security and military ties that seem to be developing. So, Jeff, I'm going to turn first to you.
Okay. I'm trying to do all of this as concisely as possible. To the question of can the U.S. actually have a strategic focus on the region, given all of the other things on its plate, including the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the recently announced pivot to Asia, I think that's an open question. And one of the things that we're trying to do with this report is make sure that the region remains on the policy agenda in Washington, even as the attention of many policymakers in this town is going to be focused on precisely those things that the colleague from the Israeli embassy mentioned. One thing I would note in that context is that the U.S. vision for the future of Afghanistan, in particular, once it withdraws, is encapsulated in this notion of the New Silk Road that Secretary Clinton spoke about starting in the fall of last year, and which you continue to hear about. And I would just point out that for this vision to ever succeed as something other than the kind of formation of regional trading links between Afghanistan and its neighbors, the Caucasus has a pivotal role to play. If you think about what areas exist in order to move goods and people between Inner Asia, Afghanistan, Central Asia, South Asia, and Europe, again, this gets back to the notion of the Caucasus as being a kind of strategic crossroads. And I think for that reason alone, perhaps, there should be sustained focus on the future of the region in the United States. Whether the capacity and the bandwidth to do that is there, I think remains something of an open question. On the questions about the U.S. role as an honest broker in the region and what specifically that means, I think that's a fair question. The point that I think is developed a little bit more broadly in the report is that the United States, like many of the other outside powers in the region, including Russia, Turkey, and the Europeans, has close relations with certain of the local actors, which therefore make it difficult for it to have any kind of relations with some of the other local actors. And in the context of Georgia, of course, that means that the close relationship between Washington and Tbilisi has meant that it's been difficult for the United States to have any sort of engagement with the breakaway regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And so what I'm talking about in the report in the context of the U.S. being an honest broker is simply figuring out a way in which it is able to talk to some of these other groups, regardless of who they are. And I think I would, the questioner spoke of the Russian military authorities as being the real controlling power in these breakaway regions. And I think in a de facto sense that may be true, but in terms of how the U.S. can actually fulfill this role of an honest broker, I think one of the things that it needs to do more of is figuring out how to talk to the local authorities directly rather than channeling that engagement through Moscow. One of the suggestions that was made during the conference, I think perhaps certainly facetiously, was that what the U.S. really needs to do is offer NATO membership action plans to South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Now, I wouldn't go that far, but nevertheless, I think there does need to be some kind of a channel to the authorities de facto in those regions, in part precisely as a way to make sure that they are focused on dealing with these problems on the ground, on dealing with the humanitarian situation in the region, rather than serving as a kind of geopolitical, rather than allowing themselves to be used as a kind of geopolitical tool by Moscow or by anybody else. The more that they can focus on these problems on the ground rather than be part of these broader geopolitical games, I think the more likely it is that there's going to be progress towards this vision of regional integration that we're proposing. Of course, politically that's a very difficult thing to do, and I think that's one of the areas where the report, to get to Ambassador Evans' point, we're trying to push the envelope a little bit. I realize it's an idea that is bound to be controversial, but again, I agree that that should be the role of think tanks, is to put forward some of these ideas that maybe would not get a hearing within the halls of government, at least at this particular moment in time. Let's see, on the question of the Russian envoys, I think I'll leave that to Sergei. On the question of the Armenian defense minister's visit and the U.S.-Armenian relationship, to the extent that both Yerevan and Washington are focused on the need to prevent resumption of violence in the region. I think certainly they are on the same page. The U.S. does have, this is actually an area I think the U.S. has done a fairly good job of being able to talk to both sides. The U.S. does have good relations, relatively speaking, with both Armenia and Azerbaijan. And I think it is, certainly something that the State Department, the Defense Department, the White House have included in their meetings with officials from both of these countries when they visit, which is that above all, there needs to be a focus on preventing a resumption of violence, which would be very negative, would be catastrophic for people all across the region.
Sergey?
Thank you. In the conditions of the deficit of time, I would send you my 2 comments published on Radio Liberty, especially concerned to appointments of 2 envoys. Now I would speak very briefly. I'm not an admirer of 2 appointments due to some reasons. The first reason is bureaucratic, it's understandable. There are embassies of Russia in both Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Now we are not going to discuss legal status of those embassies. I think that additional appointment would create many obstacles and some bureaucratic disaster in the Abkhazia and South Ossetian direction. The second point is more serious. I'm not sure that 2 candidates, Alexander Tkachev, governor of the Krasnodar region, and Temras Mamsurov, are best options for 2 positions. Don't forget that Georgian-Ossetian conflict is directly connected with Ossetian and Ingush conflict. And it's problematic to have ethnic Osset like special representative of Russian Federation in South Ossetia. If you want to have anybody to be appointed, please find guys in Moscow, not in the North Caucasus, taking into account this situation. As for Alexander Tkachev, don't forget his personal role in events of 2004 in Abkhazia. Abkhazia is a very small ethnic group. This is why it has good memory. And Alexander Tkachev has negative reputation for his activity in Krasnodar, anti-Armenian activity, anti-Kurdish, anti-Turkish, and so on. Repeating once again my thesis about small ethnic group, it's not good reputation to be appointed like presidential envoy in Abkhazia. And I know about personal disagreement between current ambassador of Russia in Sukhumi, Simeon Grigoriev, and apparatus of Alexander Tkachev. This is why I'm not a great fan of this appointment due to bureaucratic and technical point of view. As for Televini report, I am a rare case, honestly speaking, I'm a rare case of persons who really read this report from the first page till last. Yes, yes. I agree, Televini report characterized the Russian activity in August 2008 like invasion. But at the same time, the same report characterized or blamed Georgia for attack on Skinval. Yes, yes. And this report kept very positive estimation of Russian peacekeepers in South Ossetia. And attack of Russian peacekeepers was considered in this report like casus belli.
Public hearings, request public hearings of Televini report.
Okay, let's meet. I would name concrete page of this report. No problem. I'm ready. Not right now, but it's discussable.